Hello and welcome to a new episode of The Bike Show, in which we will find out about some simply ridiculous bargains that will be available until the end of this month at Fire It Up, and I get to tell you about a short holiday I went on recently. No, that didn't come out right, did it? What I meant to say was I experienced an arduous 2-day test on your behalf to bring you a report on Ducati's new Multistrada V2. And joking aside, given the occasionally horrendous weather and very dodgy riding conditions, it was unfortunately closer to a feat of endurance than a holiday. Given that I'm talking about the world launch of the Multistrada V2, which I cracked the nod to because I happened to be in the area and talking to the right person at the right time, grazie, Gerardo, and given the restrictions inherent in these events, no dedicated camera person, so I can't film what I want, when I want, and given the fact I'm on someone else's prescribed route, riding at their pace, stopping to do some filming when they say so, this test will obviously have a different format to the stuff I usually film. But the bonus is I can also give you a bit of a behind-the-scenes insight into how these events work and my reflections on the bike before, during and after I've spent a couple of days with this new model. Right, the bike itself is an update of the Multistrada 950. Let's not beat around the bush here. The detailed presentation revealed that, really, the updates, at least in terms of the spec sheet, are not particularly significant. In fact, on the face of it, the most important change would appear to be to the bike's designation. In line with its new naming procedure, this smaller of the Multistradas now has a V2 in its title to differentiate it from its big brother, the V4. Okay, that might be just a bit too glib, even for me, but let me stress at this point that the Multistrada 950 was already a properly excellent all-rounder, and so to keep it ultra competitive, all that needs to be done, in theory, is a bit of polishing. Ducati itself wants to make the bike even more rider-friendly and easy to ride than it was, because this is the entry-level model with what is called a middleweight engine option. I know I've said it before, but still, this whole idea that something that is basically the same capacity as the iconic 916 superbike of the mid-1990s is now regarded as a middleweight shows how far the game has moved on in the last 20 years or so. Bear in mind that in terms of horsepower, this middleweight all-rounder actually makes, at 113 horsepower, a handful more than that bike did, and weighs a couple of kilos less as well, I think. So, entry-level do-it-all bike it may be, but it has the numbers to qualify as a badass World Superbike race replica from not that long ago. Anyway, I have, as usual, found a tangent to divert me from the task at hand, which is those detail changes that, as I was trying to say, are primarily concerned with making the bike easier to ride and to live with. So we have a lower and thinner seat, which I will add right now was very comfortable over the 2 days we rode, with the caveat that I never spent much more than about 90 minutes at a time between stops. One of the ways to make sure that more people feel more comfortable on a bike is to give them a lighter clutch, which they've done, and make sure they can reach the ground easily. The lower and thinner seat helps to do that, and so for a quasi-adventure bike, this Multi is actually better than any I can remember in that respect. There's a new tail end and seat, some new mirrors and wheels, courtesy of the V4 Multi, and that's about your lot as far as the aesthetics go. Oh, apart from a new engine cover as well. As you'd expect with Ducati, there's two models of the Multi V2, a base version and then the S, which we got to ride. This obviously comes with a lot more goodies, which I'll get into in a while. The changes that promise more of a dynamic effect on performance are the bits and pieces of weight saving that have been done over the previous 950. Overall, 5 kilos has gone missing on this updated model, 2 kilos of that coming from the engine, with the vast majority of that coming from the redesigned clutch. Another half kilo comes from the brake disc carriers, and then there's 700 grams from those mirrors I mentioned that have been borrowed from the V4. And finally, there's 1.7 kilograms gone from the wheels. Nothing massive in terms of numbers, but since so much has come from spinning bits and bobs, whether that be in the engine or the wheels, it probably makes a more meaningful difference than the numbers alone suggest. As you can see, there's nothing to really jump out at you from the pre-ride press briefing, and when I realised that the launch would forego the usual one-day mad dash and be in the form of a two-day tour, my cynical journalist hackles started rising. What better way to distract from the lack of improvement in the bike than by treating us to a short holiday, all expenses paid in one of the most beautiful parts of Italy, all while keeping us topped up with the highest quality food and wine. I had seen through their dastardly plan. I would not succumb to such obvious, crude bribery, and I would reveal the truth to you, dear viewers, like any upstanding investigative reporter. Yes, they might try, but this journalist would not be corruptible. Unless, of course, the launch gift was truly exceptional. The gift turned out to be an aluminium water bottle with a Ducati logo on it, so I remained uncorrupted, intent on being laser focused on the important task ahead. The tour started in the Villa Lena on top of a hill about an hour or so to the east of Pisa, the place with the dodgily built tower. Very pretty, and after some apéro and a fine meal on the first evening, where I had a grand time meeting some of my fellow journalists from Sweden, Russia, Austria, Czechoslovakia and the UK, and some great people from Ducati, I awoke the next day with only a moderate headache. This was not from any excess red wine from the previous evening, you understand, but from the puzzle I had fitting my overnight luggage in the panniers. Fair play though, the panniers do swallow up more kit than you'd think, even though the right-hand one is compromised slightly by the exhaust cutting into its space. Pack the soft inner bags in your room, then easily stuff them into the panniers on the bike. Opening and closing is easy, and they feel very secure. And then the ride started. Beppe, our guide and a legend of a man, headed off after a few briefing words that amounted to, "Don't ride like a bunch of arses, rather show me how professional you all are because you're respected journalists, blah-de-blah." The first kilometre or two was some downhill gravel roading with a bit of stand-up, so it was into enduro mode and an easy bimble down to the tar road in the bottom of the valley. Nothing to report here. The bike coped easily. The enduro mode let me skid the rear wheel to absolutely no effect, other than to make my lack of off-roading skill very public. And of course the ABS remained on the front, thankfully. One thing worth mentioning at this point though is that I managed easily on my own to work out how to change the modes via the switchgear. So importantly, the Multi V2's electronics are a breeze to operate, even for a man who thinks ordering and paying for food via a phone app and a taxi firm is the work of the devil. And then we were off, a long line of Multistrada V2s winding their merry way along a series of small twisting back roads through some truly spectacular Tuscan scenery. Unfortunately, the glimpses of that were restricted by a generous helping of low cloud that threatened a fresh onslaught of rain. But the roads were wet and greasy anyway from an overnight downpour, and then in places the dark grey tar would give way to a treacherous carpet of rusty brown autumn leaves, just to make the prospect of braking, leaning and accelerating that little bit more interesting. The pace wasn't very fast, but already from my position halfway along the snake of riders, I could see that one or two were beginning to struggle with the pace. Understandably nervous about leaning too far in the horrible conditions, the first few riders would leave them in the turns, and then there'd be an over-enthusiastic burst of acceleration down the next straight, a bit of late braking that wasn't actually that late, a slow wobble around the turn, and then some more red line bashing action along the next straight, all the while gradually falling a little further adrift of the guys ahead, who, by the way, were two older, very experienced journos from the UK, and of course our Ducati guide. Although we'd had the usual briefing about not doing any overtaking, I was about to break that rule and put the accident waiting to happen riders behind me when, well, the waiting to happen was suddenly over. Exiting one left-hander, a bike went down, losing the rear end and pirouetting along the road with the rider following closely behind. I dodged his bike and the rider, everyone stopped, and I went up the road to find the guide who I knew would also have stopped. He was not amused by the news I gave him, and off he went back to the scene of the crime. Fortunately, the rider was absolutely fine and the bike was still rideable, so no major hassle. When the group was reassembled, the obviously irritated guide told us we were idiots if we were in sport mode, like the Crasher had been, because the traction control is the least intrusive in this setting, and in this case had let the rear step out too far on some of the waterlogged leaves. I was also in sport mode, but I'm ancient compared to most journalists these days, and I learned to ride in a permanently sodden UK long before bikes had electronics. But I'm still an idiot, and over the rest of the day I made sure to try all 4 modes, eventually settling on touring or sport for most of my time on the bike. You can treat urban like a rain mode because the throttle response is really soft and forgiving, and the suspension is very soft, actually too soft for some of those lumpy Tuscan roads, which would often have the rear shock bottoming out with my generous 90 kilo riding weight and the luggage to deal with as well. In fact, since the modes on the S version we were riding affected the skyhook suspension instead of just the engine response and traction control and the like, the whole character of the bike pretty much changes depending on which one you choose. This is one of the best things about modern bikes with semi-active electronically adjustable suspension. The fact that you effectively get several bikes in one, each one available at the push of a button. Separate to that, there's also the ability to change the suspension's preload settings by swapping between symbols that indicate rider, rider with pillion, rider with luggage, that sort of thing. Pretty handy for whenever you carry a pillion, because let's be honest, how often on a traditionally suspended bike do you get the C-spanner out and adjust the settings to compensate for the dollop of lard that's now messing with your bike's handling? Yeah, like me, the answer to that is probably never. I see the time is marching on a bit quickly and I'm being as long-winded as usual, so let's take a short break and I'll wrap up this launch report in the next part of the programme. Welcome back. I was talking you through what happens on a world launch of a new model. In this instance, it's Ducati's Multistrada V2 and we're on a 2-day ride through Tuscany. There's already been one crash on wet leaves, which sounds a bit like a British rail excuse, and just as the drizzle starts to fall properly, we arrive at our first photo stop.
All the same on these launches, 2 or 3 kilometre loop, right at one end, couple of photographers along the way, wait for everyone to come through, then turn back and go the other way, then just a bit of hint of drizzle. There is a rather moist surface, as long as you're gentle, it's alright. I don't like this bit there where you sit around and let any heat get out of the tires.
You can't really see it on the pics, but it's pretty damn wet. My visor was steaming up. There is, as I mentioned, now no heat in the tyres because we spend so much time waiting around between each run. But as long as you're careful, gentle with the inputs on the throttle and the brakes, then there's no worries. The tyres are Pirelli Scorpion Trail 2s, and even when they're cold, the level of grip is, well, it's pretty amazing really, though there's not a lot of feel. When they're warm, the grip is simply excellent, but I have to say the feel, at least on the road, doesn't go up in a corresponding manner. The 2 days of this trip were a torture test for tyres, but these Pirellis, they barely noticed. As long as you were smooth and had faith, you could lean and brake and accelerate much more enthusiastically than you'd have thought possible really. Very, very impressive. Tyre technology has undoubtedly progressed almost immeasurably since I've been doing this job, and you can say something similar about the sophistication of suspension as well. I said in my V4 Multistrada test a few weeks back that I thought its semi-active suspension was the best I'd ever experienced on a road bike, and this version of Skyhook that's on the Multi V2 is similarly inspiring. From soft and squidgy urban mode where you'd barely notice any curbs you might hop, to sport where there's enough firmness and feedback to start feeling like you're on a dedicated sport bike, the range of remotely adjustable options within what is basically a do-it-all kind of touring bike is something to experience. Even when you firm it up too much by dialing in passenger with luggage on the preload settings, there's a level of plushness to the ride quality, even in sport mode, that means you don't end up getting battered about like you might expect on some of the more unpleasant Tuscan roads. At the other end of the scale, urban, it's too soft for my liking. Yes, it makes a good rain mode, I suppose, but hit a series of bumps and dips and you'll be in danger of getting seasick. There's so much movement in the suspension. Our afternoon ride was cut a little short because the rain came down properly, like flood level properly, but that didn't stop us visiting another of the endless wonderful historical sites in Tuscany.
It's just driving rain and everything's sodden. I think I'm still dry here, but everything sort of from the waist down is wet and the boots are ridiculously sodden. You don't learn a massive amount about a bike in this sort of weather, other than whether it's easy to ride or not, and this is very easy to ride.
At this point, I was ready for my dinner, so thankfully we headed straight to our overnight accommodation where, after a quick shower, we were taken to an extraordinary winemaker's by the name of Petra, where we were treated to some delicious nosh and a variety of even more delicious wines that made me very happy, despite my recent brush with hypothermia. The next day we had some drier weather, some more scenic sights, and of course the obligatory photo stops, starting with one for some tracking pictures and video.
All those beautiful magazines that you read, stunning pictures, just looking also kind of like they just happen. But after a day of raining, the bikes are a little bit dirty, and now we're at a photo stop. There's a line of, is it cypress trees or something? That looks absolutely stunning. But the Ducati guys are busy cleaning one of the bikes to make it look particularly fantastic, which all the journalists will then take turns having a go on. So they're all on a super clean bike for all the pictures that are then obviously seen all around the world.
By the way, if you ever happen to find yourself doing some tracking photos on a bike, here's a handy tip that was passed down to me by my boss at a British bike magazine back in the day. Don't try to adjust your speed relative to the tracking vehicle with the throttle. Get yourself in as high a gear as possible and then fine-tune your speed with the back brake. Basically use the rear brake to constantly drag against the throttle, and don't forget to tuck in if you're on a fast bike. It helps make the image look much more enticing, like you're doing 200 k's an hour rather than the 20 you're actually doing. With this being the driest conditions of the two-day test, we had the chance for a slightly brisker ride now, and once I'd disobeyed the rules and overtaken a couple of the more sedate guys, it was possible for the first time to actually start hammering the throttle and brakes a little more aggressively. 113 horsepower is almost embarrassing on any kind of bike with sporting pretensions these days, except it shouldn't be. It's more than enough for making rapid progress, and to be fair, it's the 94 Newton meters of torque and where it arrives that's more important. The vast majority of us ride the vast majority of the time in the bottom and mid-range. Even on a brisk ride, few of us spend much, if any, time in the final third of the rev range, so it's how an engine grunts itself forward with just 2.5 or 3,000 RPM on the rev counter, and how smoothly and cleanly it pulls through to, in the V2's case, let's say 7,000 or 8,000 RPM. It does this very well indeed, and it's made more enjoyable by the fact that even in the sport mode it will roll on and off the throttle with no snatchiness, just an utterly predictable response. That sounds obvious and, well, to be expected, but you'd be surprised how often it isn't the case these days. Increased use of the throttle meant more speed, and that meant the corners needed to be dealt with at a higher speed too, and once again everything here was, well, it was just right on the money. Easy to steer, no need to hang off even a little bit. Even on those slimy, greasy roads, I spent 2 days locked in a comfortable riding position and never felt the need to fidget around in the seat and use my body weight to help the bike do its thing. It's just a wonderfully neutral, faithful, enjoyable bike to ride quickly. The suspension is brilliant. The engine has got more than enough to get you into trouble if you don't concentrate, and yet it will also trickle along at scenery admiring speeds just as happily. The brakes are good. You wouldn't expect anything else these days, really, would you? And on the S version, the auto blipper gearbox is smooth and precise, and the TFT screen is a delight to use, as are the controls for changing the huge array of adjustable riding aids. The S version also brings you the skyhook suspension, cruise control, and some LED cornering lights. I still can't get my head around the fact that even on the S version, you need to pay extra for heated grips by getting the travel pack. That also brings you the panniers and the centre stand. But that's something for you to argue about with your Ducati dealer. I will just add though that all manufacturers like to bang on these days about all the safety aids they've built into their hugely complex and expensive riding electronics, but the biggest single difference they could now make to safety, and probably the cheapest, is to make sure the rider's hands are warm enough to use a brake lever and throttle effectively. If you've ever tried going for an emergency brake use in the depths of winter with hands turned blue by the cold, you'll know what I mean. Someone much smarter than me needs to start a hashtag thing, Grips for Safety campaign or something, and shame all these manufacturers into doing the right thing. Heated grips on any bike over, say, 5,000 euros. Nearly made it through a test without whinging, and then I blew it there right at the end. Oh well, apart from that, I'd have to say that this bike it's pretty much faultless. You will struggle to find any bike in this middleweight class that can do so much, so well. But there's always a but, isn't there? You will, of course, have to pay for the pleasure. In South Africa, if I go by the prices over here, you'll pay about 265,000 Rand for the base model and 310,000 or so for the S. And then for the other options that bring such essentials as the heated grips, you'll obviously have to pay a bit more. Do I think it's worth it? Yes, 100%. This is a superb sport touring bike with a bit of adventure riding possible on the side as well. And I say that having been forced to ride through a wintry monsoon and with only a 50 Rand drinks container as a bribe.